Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. An original adaptation written and read for you by Jon Buckeridge. Part 10. The Beasts of the Blighted Land. Gawain hugged the man, or rather the man hugged him, a vice-like embrace around his middle as tears sprung up in his eyes. A few moments ago he'd ridden into that village at a thunderous pace, fleeing from hideous wolf-like creatures close behind, and this same man had been a picture of abject outrage, fuming with fury. Then Gawain had taken a look around and tried to understand things from the villagers' point of view. "How long have these creatures been terrorizing your village?" he'd asked the man. "And how can I help you be free of them?" He had watched as all the anger melted out of him, and all that was left was raw, naked terror. Already a small man, he seemed to have shrunk down on himself. His face, purple with fury just a few moments ago, went waxy, grey and drawn. "Oh," he had said, his recently bellowing voice suddenly small. "Would you? Could you?" And then there was this hug. There was no word of warning, he just barreled into Gawain and embraced him. He'd almost knocked him clean off his horse. Gawain was led into a cosy cottage, where a pot boiled over a small fire and the man poured him some tea. "Stanley is my name," he explained. "I suppose I'm what you might call the head man of the village. Or at least I'm what's left, anyway." There was a great sadness as Stanley spoke, and Gawain stayed silent as he went on, letting him find his own way into his story. "This year has not been good." Gawain knew it for understatement, but clearly Stanley was just warming up to a difficult topic. "It wasn't like this round here, before. I've lived here all my life. I can tell you this was a lovely place to live. There were no trenches dug round the borders, no spiked fences, no gates. We were we were a village like any other. We went to church together, we brought in the harvest together, we crowned the May Queen and, village stuff. We were happy. People danced and wed and bore fat little babies. There were no fights beyond the usual and no trouble to speak of and none of these creatures." He gestured outside, and Gawain recalled the pack of dark shapes that had hounded him and Gringolet into the village in the first place. "What are they?" he asked Stanley, interrupting for the first time. "And when did they first appear?" Stanley gave a wry smile. "We called them the Wolves of Winter, on account of them first appearing in the winter, right on New Year's Eve, but, well, they're not like any wolves I've ever seen." "Too big," Gawain agreed with the man, "and they move wrong." "Not just that," said Stanley, "but they think wrong. Wolves have the wisdom of nature, don't they? They hunt in the forests and occasionally out on the plains, but they don't go near groups of people, do they? They don't like the fire and the houses and all the noise and the scents that we make, and they keep well enough alone. Not these things, though. They came right up the hill and into the village and laid about killing livestock and worse. Thank goodness it was winter and more folk were indoors, or it would have been worse still, you can be sure." He was silent for a moment and stared at the surface of his tea. Eventually he said in a still, small voice, "They took 3 people that first day, stone dead. Imagine that as a way to start the year. And it only got worse from there." Gawain let that sink in, and now he could understand why the villagers all looked so scared, and why the damaging of the gate would seem like the most important thing in the world to them. "After that first night, we did what you usually do when creatures get too curious. We lit fires around the village, stood men on guard, and tried to scare them off. But it didn't work. Next, some of the men decided it was time to fight back, They formed a group, armed themselves as best they could, and set off in search of the beast's lair. They found it too, though it did no good. 1 man came back, but not for long. Eventually we decided defence was the only way to survive. We built the barriers, we dug the ditches, we hung the gates. Since then we've not lost anyone else, but the village is... well, you've seen it. People round here have begun to believe that we're cursed. They call it the Blighted Land. Maybe they're right." He lapsed into silence again. "How many have they taken?" asked Gawain. 21, replied Stanley. It was brittle and flat, and Gawain could tell he was trying to tamp down the feelings hidden behind those numbers. And how many have you killed? Asked Gawain. 3, came the reply, again in that same flat tone. So we know that they can be killed, Gawain said. How did you do it? The usual ways, Stanley said without much emotion. Sharp things, a strong blow to the head or neck, fire. I thought you said fire didn't harm them, Gawain interjected. Well, they're not afraid of fire like most creatures are, but they can certainly come out the worst from it. We managed to shove one into a watchfire a few months back and it went up in the end. Interesting, said Gawain, an idea beginning to take root in his mind. It's all well and good knowing they can be hurt, said Stanley, but getting close enough to do it, well, that's another matter. They are terrible vicious. That, said Gawain, the idea now forming more fully in his imagination, is something I am counting on. All that day Gawain made his preparations. Stanley called in all the villagers to assist, and Gawain set them to work. Some he set to sharpening long stakes and hardening them in fires to make pikes at least 9 or 10 feet long. Others he set to digging trenches across the fields below the village, working out wide and narrowing to a single point. A third group was set to bring together all the oil the village could spare. All that day they worked, and long into the night. The next morning all the village came together in digging a huge deep hole near the end of the field where the trenches converged. At the base of the hole they drove in several of the fire-hardened spikes. Then they lined the rest of the ground with as much dry brushwood as they could find. They covered over the pit with a web of thin willow sticks loosely decorated with grass and leaves. Eventually, the plan was ready. So, you know your roles? Asked Gawain to nods of assent. As soon as you see fire, the hunt is afoot. As evening drew in, Gawain checked his armour and weapons, and found Gringolet grazing by the path. Gawain was not a rider who was in the habit of talking to his horse, as some do, but he stroked Gringolet's long nose as he checked all the bridle and tack, and muttered to him softly, I hope you are well rested, my friend. I'm afraid much of today's plan relies on you. The horse whickered softly, snuffling at Gawain's hand, and Gawain decided he would take that as a good sign. He swung himself into Gringolet's saddle and set off out of the village. He was accompanied by Stanley and 3 of the other villagers who Stanley had named Rob, Will and Eric. They're good lads, Stanley had said. They'll help us see this through one way or the other. Each of them rode a pack horse or pony, and each of them carried one of the long pikes and a large rectangular shield hastily woven of willow and backed with leather. They carried nothing else, except a small flask of oil each. Gawain looked at the men, thinking they were like children's imitations of knights. But then these men weren't trying to be knights, they were just trying to keep their village alive. He nodded to them, and they nodded back, and the 5 of them set out. Rob was the handiest woodsman in the group, so he led them quietly to the place where the unfortunate raiding party of the past had found the creatures. Half a mile off, they paused, and Rob pointed it out to them. At the edge of the woods, the tree line split around a small ravine. Steep rock lined each side and formed a small valley cut into the hill. The entrance to it was narrow, perhaps enough for 2 men to walk side by side, but once through, it opened up, forming a sort of cave but with the roof exposed to the elements. According to Rob, that was where the creatures had claimed as their den. You're sure it only has 2 entrances, confirmed Gawain. He spoke softly, because although they were still some way off, he did not know how good the hearing of the creatures was. Of course, replied Rob, also pitching his voice low. I grew up here. We used to play in that snick as lads before those things took it over. Gawain nodded. You know what to do then, he said. The 4 men dismounted and set their horses to wander back home. Then Stanley, Rob, Will and Eric walked silently off through the trees, leaving Gawain alone. He too dismounted, but kept Gringolet with him, leading him by the reins. Gradually, ever so gradually, he led Gringolet to the mouth of the ravine and waited. From his end of the tiny valley he looked down on dozens of the grey forms. In the dying of the light it was hard to make out exactly how many there were, but he was struck again by the sheer size of them. For now they lazed and dozed around their lair, and Gawain crouched as silent and still as he could possibly make himself, aware that any sound he made would ruin the plan. After what felt like days, he heard a soft whistle like a robin's song, and he knew that the men were in place. Squinting to the other end of the ravine, he could just make out Stanley and the villagers moving silently. Inch by inch, they entered the far side of the little valley. First Stanley and Will, then Rob and Eric, carrying the big willow shields in front of their bodies. The 4 men completely blocked the far end of the ravine in 2 neat ranks, one behind the other. Their shields were braced against the ground, covering almost all of their bodies, with those long pikes thrust out in front. The shields may not have stood up to arrows and spears, but then they weren't fighting arrows and spears, and if all went to plan, they would not have to fight anything for long. With another whistle, the men confirmed that they were ready, and Gawain held his breath in anticipation. There was a cracking sound as 4 flasks of oil broke on the ground a yard or so away from where the men stood in their solid ranks. Immediately there was the familiar chip and hiss of a spark being struck, and flames burst into life at the far end of the gully. Instantly the creatures stirred, and just as Stanley had said, they did not shy away from the flames, but flung themselves towards them. In the dancing firelight, Gawain could see the faces of Will and Stanley as they braced themselves behind their shields, and behind them, Rob and Eric thrust forward with their pikes. Gawain did not know if one had been killed, but there was a horrible mewling wail from one of the creatures as a pike hit home. Still the beasts threw themselves at the men, and still they stood their ground and blocked the way. The air was alive with snarls and shrieks as the creatures attacked, though every now and then another mewling wail would mark a thrust striking home. The men were standing their ground well, but Gawain knew they could not stand for long. But they did not need to, for now it was Gawain's turn to act. Striking his own spark, he lit the torch in his hand, and remounting Gringolet, he charged into the mouth of the gully, swinging down with his great green axe and striking the creatures from behind as they pressed to get to Stanley and his men. Before they fully realized what was happening, he'd managed to dispatch 2 or 3. Sensing a new attack, the creatures hurled themselves towards him. Stanley and his men were entirely forgotten, and seizing the moment, Gawain wheeled round on Gringolet. Jabbing his heels into the horse's flanks, he set off sprinting from the mouth of the ravine. Gawain held his torch high above him so the creatures could see him clearly, and over the thundering of his horse's hooves, he could hear them following behind. Gawain charged on across the field, the whole pack of creatures streaking behind with all the viciousness Stanley had promised, exactly as Gawain had hoped. As he flew across the field they'd prepared, he heard another of the mewling shrieks as creatures fell into the trenches behind him. Turning his head, he saw villagers moving up in pairs, thrusting down at the fallen body with long pikes. There was no time to celebrate, though, because this only seemed to enrage the creatures more, and they redoubled their speed. Urging Gringolet on, Gawain hurtled towards the far end, right towards the pit they had dug together. Praying Gringolet still had the strength to make the jump, he pulled on the reins, and the horse soared into the sky and safely down onto the other side. Their pursuers, though, were not so lucky. The creatures sprinted out onto the web of leaves and grass and fell right through. Snarls and shrieks gave way to wails and howls as their bodies broke on the ground or were skewered on the spikes. "Light them!" barked Gawain as he dismounted Gringolet, and the villagers rushed forward, pouring oil into the pit, followed by the chip hiss of struck sparks. Instantly the pit was alight with fierce flames, and the creatures inside sent forth fresh cries. It seemed the pit had done its work, but from his position Gawain could see some were clawing their way out of its edges. "Pikes!" he called. "Be sure that none of them escape!" And the villagers rushed forward, always in pairs, to dispatch them and push them back into the pit. The whole village stood vigil as the flames grew to embers, ensuring that none of the creatures could escape. As they watched, Stanley and his men walked back to join them. Rob walked with a limp, and Eric had a nasty gash on his scalp, but all 4 of them were present. "Did any escape?" he asked Stanley. "None," replied the small man. Again it was that small, flat voice he'd used when Gawain had met him. This had been grisly work, and Gawain had to remind himself that they were not warriors. Eventually, the embers died, and as the first rays of dawn reached the field, Gawain called for the bodies of the beasts to be brought to the great pit and buried. They marked the massive mound with a cairn in memory of that night, and even as they finished the final efforts, he heard some of the villagers referring to it as the Battle of the Blighted Land. Gawain smiled. He knew this was no battle, and probably so did they, but who was he to take this moment away? This story would be told in that village for generations upon generations, and he could already see it growing with each retelling. As he led Gringolet up the hill, he grinned warmly. Here was a place where he had definitely made people's lives better. Settling the horse at a trough for a well-earned drink and some food, he shambled wearily away to find a quiet corner and some sleep. Thank you for listening. Sir Gawain and the Green Knight is a Settle Stories commission. Written and read for you by Jon Buckeridge. Story consultant was Miriam Sarin. Music was Tectonic by Saedra, downloaded via Uppbeat. It was a Parable Arts production.